crimes he had committed in Chile several decades earlier, a Spanish magistrate had issued an arrest warrant for his arrest because some of the victims in Chile were Spanish nationals. That arrest warrant was sent up to England, where he was arrested for crimes that had occurred over 20 years earlier, half a world away. We are seeing a lot more of those kind of things. Now, ultimately, nothing happened because he was believed to be too old, too infirm for him to be prosecuted, and so he went back home, never to travel again. In fact, I think just last week that the present Chilean government is investigating former political and military officers for potential trials around some of the desaparecidos, the disappeared ones that they created back in the 1970s. We're seeing much more of this. The newest development, two new developments that have occurred fairly recently. In the summer of 2008, there was a naturopathic doctor was arrested in Belgrade. And it turns out he was actually Radovan Karadzic. He was kind of number two to Slobodan Milosevic. He was the head guy in the Republic Srpska, which is the part of Bosnia that was subject to the ethnic cleansing. He had gone into hiding, and he was on the run for many, many years. And he had essentially been living, and he, basically recreated himself as this doctor of naturopathic medicine, living openly under a false name when he was finally caught and apprehended. And he is currently in The Hague awaiting trial, and it looks like that's going to be happening fairly soon. The other is that Omar al-Bashir, the head of the Sudanese government, has had an arrest warrant issued for his arrest. And what has happened is we have a new kind of court now. In the wake of the Rwandan and Bosnian trials, the United Nations set up these tribunals, which were these ad hoc creations intended to prosecute the perpetrators of the genocide in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda. But there were a lot of startup problems and difficulties with that. So in 1998, with the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court was created. And it's also based in The Hague. And the Netherlands are becoming kind of the center of international human rights law. But essentially, this court has its standing job to investigate and prosecute these kind of crimes. And it's starting out with a bang, because their chief prosecutor basically asked for an arrest warrant to be issued against Omar al-Bashir. They heard it, and just a few months ago, they basically granted that arrest warrant. So here's the deal. Omar al-Bashir, if he travels to other countries, is subject to arrest anywhere and prosecution. Now the problem is he actually has been traveling to countries sympathetic to what he's doing, and he's been treated as a hero. But those kind of countries are becoming much more isolated and fewer and far between. And it is hoped, and the intention of this kind of initiative is that political leaders will need to think a little more carefully about the potential ramifications, legal ramifications for them personally when they engage in these kind of policies. It's certainly not perfect. It really, in many ways, is, these kind of laws are often honored in the breach more than in actual practice. But what we're seeing is a growing trend along these lines. We're seeing more and more of this happening. And here's the thing, and I think the US has been very guilty of this. We use a lot of these ideas around human rights, around international law, and so forth. We use them very selectively. And governments are very calculating and cynical about how they often use it. They'll point out the errors, the crimes of people we don't like, while ignoring those of our allies and our friends. The problem that they're increasingly facing is that we are living in a global world with increased communication, and that citizens of these countries take this kind of stuff much, much more seriously and more literally. And so these countries are facing a lot more pressure from the part of ordinary citizens to live up to some of these ideas and standards. I think the recent elections in Iran, and then the unrest and how all of this went around the world and provoked a lot of attention and pressure on the Iranian government. I think it kind of speaks a little bit to this. We're seeing more and more of this. Again, you know, it feels like sometimes one step forward and half a step back or something along those lines. But it does seem to me, for someone who's been studying this now for over 20 years, that we're seeing momentum. That more and more the language of human rights, of international human rights law, is becoming part of the common cultural language. And that these ideals are being enforced more often. And that governments are being held accountable more than in the past. Whether or not it's going to continue, especially in the face of some of the economic and social pressures caused by things such as global warming, I don't know. Some countries certainly are going to be much more vulnerable than others. But at least there is some cause for hope. Did I sound sincere? Was that good? I am sincere. I do think there's cause for hope. There are more and more things happening. Madeleine Albright and former Defense Secretary Cohen recently came out with a report on genocide, basically outlining policy for the United States that they believe the United States should follow in regards to genocide. R2P, the Canadian government, came out a few years back with a responsibility to protect that basically challenges governments to live up to the United Nations Genocide Convention principles of intervention and prevention. We'll see. Anyway, I know that was kind of a lot, and I apologize if I went a little long. Questions? Yes?
Yeah, something which is seldom discussed, but what about the effect of population growth on genocide in the 21st century? And generally it's ignored in the live discussions. Is it partly because we don't know what to do about it, or maybe we don't consider it a problem? And is there something linked into this whole issue?
Well, I would say that debate is going on, but it's going under a different heading, shall we say, and that is of resources. Because what we're going to see is there are societies that are increasingly going to be facing resource-scarce environments and situations, and they're going to be under a lot of pressure in many ways to define certain populations as being superfluous. The more different, genocide is about targeting those who are perceived to be different. And the more different a population is, visibly or historically, the more vulnerable they are to victimization. So you're absolutely right. There are countries that have very large populations and that face diminishing resources. And the more of that they face, the more the pressure's going to be there for different kinds of conflict around those resources. Yes?
We've seen a lot of hatred in this country, and in particular just recently. Are these people different from others? Do they have different psychological profiles? Do they have different genes? Do they have different hormone levels? I mean, what makes someone...
Who is a perpetrator?
Well, could you repeat the question a little bit? Or
the question is, what sets these people apart?
Who are these
people who are engaged in this?
These people that hate others.
Right. Wow. All right, here's my answer. Look around you. The research shows very clearly that sadists and sociopaths, people who suffer from the antisocial personality disorder, this kind of thing, they represent only a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of all the perpetrators of genocide. Most perpetrators of genocide are psychologically normal. They are law-abiding, productive members of their society before and after the violence. They are people who are convinced that they're doing something good. And think about it this way. In all of the different examples of genocide that have occurred in the 20th century and now, most of the perpetrators, genocide requires many hundreds of thousands of perpetrators. it's impossible to characterize them somehow as all being deviant